Welcome Math 107 students to the demo for lesson number 5 on models and applications. This section deals with models and applications, which many of you have called word problems. However, we're going to call them story opportunities. One of our goals today is to develop some strategies to help solve these story opportunities in order to become more confident and competent problem solvers. Let's take a look at the following bar graph that shows the number of concussions sustained between NFL backup players and starters in 2010. The source is listed there. So as you can see, the number of concussions that were sustained by backup players was greater than the number of concussions sustained by the NFL starters. However, we can't tell exactly how many concussions were sustained by each from looking at the graph. So let's take a look a little bit further for some more information. The number of concussions reported for the NFL backup players in 2010 was 6 less than twice the number reported for NFL starters in 2010. Combined, the total number of reported concussions for these NFL players was 159. How many concussions were reported for NFL backup players and starters in 2010? Sometimes you ask the question, where do I begin? So the first thing that's very important, and it needs to be stated, even though you might say, come on, I'm going to read this problem, but you really need to read the problem carefully. It's not like reading a novel. And what's important is that you identify or describe in words for yourself the quantity of, and sometimes it's more than one quantity, which is a numerical value that you're being asked to find. So in this case, the number, we have two numbers we're being asked to define. We're being asked to find the number of concussions that was reported in 2010 for NFL backup players, and then the number of concussions reported in 2010 for NFL starters. So that is where I will begin, is I'm just going to write in words, and your word should always describe a quantity, a number. So in this case, I can just start with this little symbol, number of concussions reported in 2010 for NFL backup players. That's one of the things I'm asked to find. The other thing I'm asked to find is the number of concussions reported in 2010 for NFL starters. Sometimes you can get a little more efficient with the little quotes here. Okay. Where do you go from here? Well, you know what it is you are being asked to find, so you need to assign a variable, and the variable that you use is up to you. Of course, we use X quite a bit, but you can use any letter you want. You could use C in this case if you want to, for the number of concussions. But you have to assign this variable to just one of these number of concussions, because you couldn't assign it to both, because that would be saying that these two numbers were equal. And we know from reading this first sentence that they weren't the same. So you want to assign your variable to one of these numerical quantities. So how do you decide which one to assign the variable to? Let me first state that it doesn't matter. However, it doesn't matter which of these numbers you assign the variable X, for example. But if you were to use this information given, 6 less than twice the number reported for starters, notice the number of concussions for the backup players is being described in terms of the number of concussions for your starters. So that's the number of concussion for the starters is smaller than the number of concussions from the backup players. So I usually look at how the two numbers are described, and if I can't determine which one is being described in terms of the other, I just say, which of these numbers is smaller? And that's where I assign my variable. So the number of reported concussions for the NFL starters is smaller. You can also tell that by the bar graph, but you won't always have a bar graph to look at. So I'm going to let X equal the number of concussions reported in 2010 for the starters, the NFL starters. Now I can represent the number of concussions reported in 2010 for the backup players in terms of X. I know that it's not exactly double, twice X, it's a little less, it's 6 less. So now I have defined my other unknown quantity in terms of this variable X, in terms of the number of concussions that were reported for starters. This is really key to solving any story opportunity, is when you have two different quantities, you have to be able to define each of them in terms of one variable, at least for this section of our book. Okay, let's move on. Well, to solve an equation, you've got to determine what is equal to what, right? You have to know, you have to look at the story and determine from reading it what is equal to what. Now that's kind of a silly way to say it, but we know that the total number of concussions reported was 159. So we know that the number of concussions for the backup players, and the number of concussions for the starters equals 159. So now what we do is we use our algebra to represent these two numbers, the number of concussions for each type of player. So the number of concussions for the backup player was 2x minus 6, and we're going to add to that the number of concussions for the starters, and that's going to equal 159. So when I drop those parentheses, I add 2x and 1x, and I get 3x minus 6 equals 159. I add 6 to both sides, and I get 3x equals 165. I divide both sides by 3, and I get x equals 55. So now I've just solved the equation, and I have to find all unknown quantities. So x is the number of concussions for the starters, and to find the number of concussions for the backup players, I have to follow this expression. It's twice the number sustained by the starters, which is 55, minus 6. So what does that equal? That equals 110 minus 6, which equals 104. So now I have found both unknown quantities, and I'd like to check to make sure that that works with the original wording of the original problem and not any equation that I've created since then, because if I made a mistake, then my answers would match that mistake. So the original equation said that the number reported by the backups plus the starters has to equal 159, and 159 does equal 159. So you want to always answer a story opportunity with a sentence that answers the question asked. So I would do the following. In 2010, 104 concussions were reported for NFL backups compared to 55 for NFL stars. Okay. So I hope that helps you to see how we approach solving these story opportunities. You'll have some more exercises to work with in the class activity.